Om Sahana Bhavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Saha Viryam Karavavai Tejasvinavadi Tamastu Ma Vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May Brahman protect us, may he guide us and give us strength and right understanding. May love and harmony be with us all. Peace, peace, peace. And good evening. And we are reading from Swami Abhedananda's lecture on knowledge of the self. And we got about halfway through last time, ending with the paragraph about that life is a mystery, and we endeavor to find out that mystery by studying nature, and science can only take us so far. And now we're going to continue with the paragraph, which is about halfway through the chapter. Nature makes us see the self move. That's about page 88 if you're looking at the complete works in volume 1. All right, would you like to read for us?
Nature makes us see that the self moves when the body is in motion. But in reality, the self is immovable. Nature makes us feel that self is very far from us, but it is the nearest thing that we have, nearer than this body and mind, which we consider to be the nearest. Our true self, however, is in reality the nearest of all. It dwells in everything as its soul or inner nature, yet it is outside of everything. How can that be? If it dwells inside, how can it dwell outside? Space exists inside as well as outside. Take the space within this room, which is confined by its walls. This space appears as inside the room, but what are the walls? Are they separate from space? No. They exist in and through space. They are nothing but space. The space of the walls limits the space that is inside the room. But does it limit it in reality? No, it is outside also. Can we limit the infinite space? By no means. Similarly, if we try to limit ourself by our mind, we fail, because mind is not large and strong enough to keep the self out. Sense powers cannot limit it. Physical forms can never divide it, because each one of these exists as related to the self. The self, or Atman, when properly realized, appears as unlimited and infinite. We say that we are finite beings, but in reality we are not finite. There is only one infinite existence which expresses itself through finite forms. As finite forms existing in space cannot live outside of it, so all these various individuals live in and through that infinite space of reality, which is called the Absolute Self.
Yes, and we're reminded that our true nature is one with Brahman, which is the infinite, the undivided, and the unchanging. And because of Maya, we see it just as the opposite of those things. We see it as finite, divided, and changing. And so our true nature, the Atman, which is one with Brahman, is infinite, even though we see it as finite. And it's simply because of Maya making us see everything the opposite of what it is that we think of things as limited. And of course, space and time are also part of Maya and have these inscrutable ideas that seem so difficult for us to grasp. So space is everywhere. All right, let's read another paragraph.
He who realizes all beings in the self, and the self in all animate and inanimate objects of the universe, never hates anything or any being. Hatred proceeds from imperfect relative knowledge, which makes us perceive objects as separate from one another. But when we see our true self in others, how can we hate another without hating our own self? As it is impossible to hate our true self, so it would be impossible to hate the self of any being. This is one of the results of self-knowledge. Where self-knowledge is, there can remain no feeling of hatred. When hatred is gone, jealousy and all other selfish feelings, which we call wicked, disappear. What remains? The ordinary love, which stands in opposition to hatred, vanishes. But divine love begins to reign in the heart of the seer. True love means the expression of oneness. As love for body makes us feel one with the body, so love for the true self makes us feel one with the true self. And if we see that self in others, we cannot help loving them as we love ourselves. Now we understand the meaning of love thy neighbor as thyself. It is not an extraordinary teaching. Vedanta has always taught this truth. People of the Western world say that Christ was the only one who ever taught in this way. But they do not know that this is the very foundation of the ethics of Vedanta.
Yes, it's often said that this is the root of that saying and that teaching, that the fact that we are all one, that's why you should do unto others as you would have them do to you, and to love thy neighbor as thyself. So the golden rule and love thy neighbor and so forth are both coming from this same place, that this idea that we are one. And notice that he said one with both animate and inanimate things. It isn't that Brahman is just embodied in the living. Brahman is, everything is the manifestation of Brahman. So we find it in animate and inanimate things. And so when we were talking about consciousness, we talked about how some rudimentary sentiency also exists in matter as well as in living beings. So it exists everywhere. And again, we're reminded that love is simply a manifestation of the undividedness of the reality showing through. It's the sattvic aspect of within Maya. Maya is said to have three qualities or three gunas: tamas, rajas, and sattva. Tamas is the veiling power, rajas is the projecting power, and sattva is the revealing power. And so if the reality is infinite, undivided, and unchanging, it has to show through even in our misperception of it. And so we perceive the infinite as freedom, and we perceive the undividedness as love and oneness, and we perceive the unchanging as inertia, or and our seeking for peace and security. All right, let's read another paragraph.
Love means the expression of oneness in thought, word, and deed. Where all beings have become one with the self, what delusion, what sorrow can there be to him who has once realized this unity? Self-knowledge leads to realization of oneness with all beings. When all beings appear as parts of one universal self, there is neither delusion, nor fear, nor sorrow, because there can exist no other thing outside of self or Atman for which one can grieve or from which one can suffer. Sorrow and fear arise so long as there is the sense of duality or multiplicity. If all objects of fear and sorrow become one with the all-pervading divine self, then fear and sorrow must vanish. But so long as we think of other beings which exist outside of ourself, we cannot avoid grief and suffering which arise on their account. In absolute oneness, however, there cannot remain fear, sorrow, suffering, separation, or self-delusion. This is another result of self-knowledge.
Yes, if we'd been in the temple tonight, I would have played a couple of songs from the Vivekananda oratorio, because of course Swami Vivekananda taught the same ideas, and a couple of those ideas were set to music. And so maybe next time, since we're still going to be in talking about the self, we'll play those so that you can hear the words of Vivekananda set to music that also express this idea that fear ceases when you realize this oneness, and that God interpenetrates everything. So those two ideas are expressed in two numbers of that particular musical work. Okay, do you want to read again? Okay.
Some people may think that Vedanta teaches us to be selfish, but this is far from being true. The self becomes dead. The lower self vanishes, and with its disappearance, all selfishness is destroyed. The word self must not be taken for lower self or selfishness. It stands for Atman, the higher self, which is our divine nature. There is no other expression in English by which we can convey the real meaning of Atman. We shall avoid confusion, therefore, if we use the Sanskrit word Atman to express our true self. Then no one will mistake it for selfishness. The Atman has pervaded all, is effulgent, incorporeal, scatheless, untouched by brain or nerve centers, pure, sinless, a poet, wise, omnipresent, self-existent. He has disposed of all things aright for eternity. That Atman, who is the center of the universe, is all-pervading. Wherever our mind goes, there goes the Atman. It is the source of the light of intelligence. It is pure, spotless, sinless. Here you will notice that Vedanta teaches that we are not born in sin and iniquity, but that our Atman, or true self, is sinless. By this, it does not encourage us to do sinful acts, but it tells us that the moment one acquires self-knowledge, one ceases to do anything wicked. The Atman is in the body, but it has no body. It is formless, that is, beyond gross and subtle forms. There are forms which we cannot see except through the most powerful microscope. Even such minutest forms do not affect the self. It is absolutely beyond all forms, but at the same time it can appear in any form, and all forms exist in it.
Yes, and of course, you get this a lot when you go to universities or high schools or other gatherings that have like an interfaith or interreligious course, and they ask you to come in and speak, and they'll often say that it seems like Hinduism is selfish, or that it ignores the difficulties of the poor and the struggling, and just kind of puts it off on their bad karma, so we don't need to do anything about it, or something of that nature. That's frequently the impression people get. But as he points out here, this is not the correct interpretation at all. And in fact, the more you become closer to the realization of the self, the more oneness with others you feel, and the more sympathy you feel for others, and the more you feel that it's your duty to help relieve that suffering. The more you're moved to do that, to do good to others, to do unto others as you would have done unto you. But not in a sense that I'm superior and I'm going to fix you or help you in that sense, but simply because you feel that oneness. Also, this idea of sin and the original sin and that type of thing. The way we would put it that would be more analogous to that idea is that we're born in ignorance. Our problem is ignorance, not a sinful nature, but simply that we're ignoring our true nature. We're ignoring the fact that our true nature is one with the divine. And in order to decrease that ignorance, you want to do good things. Good is a way of decreasing your ignorance, removing the ignorance. And so the idea is that through the various yogas, for example, karma yoga specifically, instructs us to do unselfish action in order to reduce our ignorance of our true nature. All right, let's read another paragraph.
Atman is beyond all nervous activity or the function of the brain. Materialists maintain that when brain and nerve centers vibrate, self-consciousness is produced. But Vedanta contradicts their statement by saying it is beyond the reach of nerve centers and untouched by brain powers. It is not affected by the changes of the body. There may be variations in the color or form of the physical body, or the body may be diseased or have some part mutilated, but that disease or mutilation will not produce any change in the true self, or Atman. Therefore, self-knowledge makes one free from nervousness and other physical ailments.
Yes, here again, right? Well, he just brings in everything here, doesn't he? So, things that we've talked about before, this idea of consciousness and trying to get consciousness out of matter and trying to get out of our material body and out of our material brains. Vedanta doesn't do it that way. We start the other way around, and we see that the Atman is the source of consciousness. Atman, Brahman are existence, consciousness, bliss, absolute. And so that consciousness or sentiency or awareness comes from the nature of Brahman. And our body-mind complex is simply a way for that to be expressed in the world of Maya. And so this sense that we are a conscious being comes about from the fact that that Atman is expressing itself through the brain and which is of course affected by the body. But it does not mean that the body is producing the consciousness to begin with. The consciousness is there from its connection with Brahman, the all-pervading reality. All right, now he's going to tell us about this word kavi, which again comes up in one of those songs that I was mentioning in the Vivekananda oratorio, about that the Brahman God is like a poet that expresses itself. All right, let's read that.
The word kavi means poet, and also means the seer of things. Self is described as the greatest poet of the universe. This is one of the most beautiful expressions and attributes that can be given to divinity. He is the poet. His poetry is the universe. He is also described as the greatest artist. His art we see in the sunrise and sunset. The sun, moon, and stars are nothing but the paintings on infinite space by the hand of the almighty artist. True self or Atman is above good and evil, beyond virtue and vice. Some people ask, how can it be above good and evil? Others say it is only good. Good and evil, however, are the relative terms. Evil exists in relation to good, and we cannot separate the one from the other.
Okay, before we get too far on, I was going to mention that I just got a message that some of you might remember Jayashree or Jamie Whitmar. She actually just won second prize in a poetry contest. So one of our members is a prize-winning poet. All right, so let's continue now with this idea of good and evil, which is another topic which frequently comes up in interfaith discussions. Okay.
If we wish to take good, we shall have to take evil also. So with virtue and vice, one cannot exist without being related to the other. The absolute self is above all relativity. Therefore it is above good and evil, beyond virtue and vice. There's no other seer than this Atman, no other knower. Who can be the knower of the universe? There is one eternal knower who knows the existence of all objects, and the knower in us is only a part of that eternal knower or God. The vast majority of mankind do not know this great truth. The preachers do not teach it because they themselves do not understand it. God is the knower of all, and the knower in us is a part of God. Vedanta tells us to realize the individual knower first. Then will the knower of the universe be known.
And of course, this can be understood from this the idea that Brahman is the absolute oneness. There is no differentiation within absolute existence, consciousness, and bliss. But in the realm of Maya, it appears as a vibrating universe. And in the vibrating universe, you get all these pairs of opposites in order for things to be experienced. Because once you're out of oneness into dualities and multiplicities, you have to have a perceiver and a perceived and an active perception. And so you get pairs of opposites in order for things to be perceived. And that's the source of what we call good and evil. But that doesn't mean that good and evil are equally useful in our particular lives. We still have a reason to pursue good and to reduce evil. And that's because, as we've just mentioned before, that by pursuing good, you reduce your ignorance. It's a method of reducing your ignorance, increasing your feeling of oneness and love and with all beings. And so that reduces your sense of egotism and envy and pride and jealousy and all of those negative emotions, which tend to amplify the little false self, which has separated itself as a subject, perceiving everything else as an object. We want to reduce that duality and eventually transcend it to the point where everything is one. It's interesting that when you read people's experiences of near-death experiences, or perhaps some sort of transcendental experience due to some sort of religious practice, they'll often express it in terms of having a knowingness of everything. Sometimes they'll call it a life review, but sometimes people that have a near-death experience say it's like a life review, but it's not like you just kind of know everything in sequence or that somebody's telling you something. It's just that there's a sense of knowingness that transcends our ordinary idea of knowing. And that there's an innate idea of transcending all this good and evil and all the dualities in the world in these experiences, even though there's still a sense of being an experiencer in these events. But it's very interesting to read those in light of Vedanta philosophy. All right, so where did we end up here? At the top of the page, right? Yeah, page, the Atman. Is that where we are?
I think we got in here. You did not wait till the end of the paragraph.
Oh, I didn't?
Right.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, go ahead.
So I'll go back a little bit.
Yeah, just we'll repeat a little bit.
The vast majority of mankind do not know this great truth. The preachers do not teach it because they themselves do not understand it. God is the knower of all, then the knower in us is a part of God. Vedanta tells us to realize the individual knower first. Then will the knower of the universe be known. The Atman, or true self, is never the object of knowledge, but is always the subject. The cosmic or universal knower is the same as that which people worship as God. Thus, by the light of Vedanta, we can see God close to our souls, but in the scriptures of special religions, he is made remote. He is driven far out of our reach. Vedanta brings him nearer than anything we possess. Although this Atman is all-pervading, yet it is beyond everything. It dwells in all things, still it is not the same as anything. It is never affected by phenomenal conditions. It transcends the changes of nature, yet it permeates nature. It is its own cause, and its cause and effect are identical. The Atman is no cause, yet it is the cause of all. And at the same time, it is beyond the law of cause and effect. The self has existed by itself from the beginningless past, and will continue to exist throughout eternity. No one can see its beginning or its end, because beginning and end refer to time, and our search after them, being within the sphere of mental activity, is also subject to time. We may search for the beginning and end of the phenomenal universe, but as the Atman is above all thought and beyond time and space, it can have neither end nor beginning.
You know, I went to an Episcopalian school, and we had a chapel service every morning. And every morning we would sing the doxology. And it wasn't until years later that it occurred to me that the sentiment of the doxology really hints at this being beyond time. It goes, glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. And so this expresses, in that Christian context, the same idea that eternity is without beginning or end, and it's beyond time. And of course, in the first part of this, it talked about how the Atman is always the eternal subject, and we have to remember too that when we see things in terms of subject and object, it's like that paradox of the Escher painting of the two hands, each one drawing the other. The subject drawing, or one hand drawing the other hand, and that hand is drawing the first hand. And so one doesn't create the other, but they both arise from the mistake of seeing the oneness as duality. And so, but the other interesting thing is that in the current thinking of quantum physics, there is no objective evidence for the plurality of the perceiver, meaning that in quantum physics the evidence seems to point to a unity in the perceiver. So even though I'm observing an experiment and you're observing in the experiment and someone else is observing the experiment, there's no evidence that there's a lot of us in here. As far as the physics goes, the perceiver of that experiment has to be one, or you end up with quantum paradoxes. All right, I think we have, actually that clock is a little fast, so we have plenty of time to finish this. I know that because I'm all-knowing. I know the clock's fast because I'm all-knowing. So.
It is all-knowing, All relative knowledge is only a partial expression of that wisdom, which constitutes the nature of the Atman. Now we see that the attributes which people generally give to God, such as He is omniscient, omnipotent, all-pervading, eternal, infinite, are also given by Vedanta to the Atman, or true self. True self is the soul of our souls. Self-knowledge reveals that the attributes of God are also the attributes of the Atman. Those we do not realize this true self dwell in the darkness of ignorance and go through the misery and sufferings which exist in that darkness. They are always fearful and unhappy. They fear death and everything that threatens their earthly existence. They make their lives miserable by attaching themselves to a particular form of manifestation which they are afraid of losing. They love sense enjoyments and worldly pleasures. They feel disappointed and discontented if they do not find these. They consider that this earthly life has no other higher aim or ideal. The life of such persons is nothing but a continuous chain of fear and unhappiness. Those who are rich fear loss of fortune. Those who have reputation and high position are afraid of losing them. Well, every man or woman suffers from the fear of disease and death. Do you suppose that these people will ever enjoy true happiness on this earth? No. They alone are true happy who have become absolutely free from fear. Perfect happiness comes, and all fear is conquered when self-knowledge is gained.
Yeah, this reminds me again of people that have had near-death experiences. Many of them will say that, and that's far from having complete self-knowledge, but it still gets you closer to that. And many of them say that they just lose the fear of death after having a near-death experience, which is one of the biggest fears that people tend to have, is the fear of death. And once they've had a near-death experience, they don't have that fear of death anymore. It simply goes. All right, this is a huge paragraph. That's why I interrupted you in the middle. It's infinite and omniscient and omnipotent.
For this reason, each one of us ought to make constant efforts to acquire it in this life. The light of self-knowledge dispels the darkness of ignorance and frees us from fear, sorrow, misery, birth and death, as also from bondage, imperfection, and illusion, which proceed from ignorance. This ignorance is likewise the mother of selfishness. It has the power to veil the divine and absolute Atman, to make us identify our true self with the material body. Thus, when forced by the inscrutable power of ignorance, avidya, we forget our real self. Think of ourselves as the sons or daughters of mortals. We become finite and subject to such limitations as are understood by the term selfishness. Self-knowledge destroys ignorance and makes one absolutely unselfish. Blessed is he who lives in the sunshine of self-knowledge, having risen above the clouds of fear and selfishness, which gather in the night of ignorance. What is this world? It is produced by ignorance and bound by fear. Knowledge of the self destroys all worldliness, brings spiritual strength, and makes one fear less, as God is fearless. Does he fear anything? How can he? The moment we realize that God dwells in us, how can we fear? How can we be afraid of death when we know that death merely means a change from one body into another, and that our true self or Atman is unchangeable? Those who do not possess self-knowledge are miserable and will be born again and again on this plane of ignorance until they have learned to realize their true self.
I've been listening to a teaching company program on DNA and people doing tests for their DNA testing and so forth. And the professor points out that many people are disturbed, but when they find out that their kind of narrative of who they are is doesn't necessarily match what their DNA says. Some of them find out that one of their parents isn't their true parent, or maybe they're adopted and neither of the people they think of as their parent is their true parent. Some of them who had a family narrative that they were, 25% Cherokee or something, and they find that there's hardly any Native American in them, or that they have some identity with a particular religious group, and then they find out that the DNA doesn't really match with that, or that they identify as a particular race, and they find that they're a huge mixture of different races. And they become disturbed by all this because they have this self-identity that they're a particular race and a particular culture, and they're in a particular family and so forth. And yet you can see that from this standpoint that the self is unchangeable, and that we're all really one. This whole idea of racial differences and ethnic differences and so forth really gets sort of wiped away. There isn't any differentiation in that sense. And really the DNA testing shows that as well. We're all 99% the same, no matter who you are. And so these differences are pretty superficial. But our normal idea of who we are is so much bound into the physical universe and our physical bodies that people sometimes become disturbed when they find out other things that they didn't know before. All right, just have a little bit more to go, and then our time will be up. So let's.
Self-knowledge is the only source of happiness. It will lead to perfection and freedom. You may seek freedom, but how can you obtain it when you have become a slave of fear and earthly conditions? You are a part of divinity. Feel it, realize it, and all these ties will drop away and you will be free. The attainment of this freedom through self-knowledge will bring you the realization of your oneness with divinity. Then you will be able to say that light which I see in the sun is in me, and that which is in me is in the sun. I am the Lord of the body, senses, and mind. I am also the Lord of all phenomenal objects. I am the light of the universe. Through me shine the sun, moon, stars, and the lightning. I've realized my true self. I've realized the true self of the universe, and therefore I am one with the Absolute.
Yes, and again, I'm reminded of the physics of the whole universe here too, where through Einstein's equation of separation and relativity, he was forced to realize that the separation between the observer and everything the observer sees with radiation, with light energy, that separation in space-time is zero. There's no separation in the four-dimensional space-time. There's separation in space and separation in time, but the separation in the four-dimensional space-time is zero. And so again, our delusion is that we are separated, and that separation occurs in space and in time. And once you've realized the oneness of yourself with Brahman, all of that goes away, and you realize that you are one with the universe, and that everything is you, and you are in everything. All right, let's close with our chant. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Filled with Brahman are the things we see. filled with Brahman are the things we see not. From out of Brahman floweth all that is. From Brahman all, yet is it still the same. Om, peace, peace, peace.
Is that camera capturing both of us?
We are one with the camera.
Was that camera?
Yeah.
Hmm?
Yeah.
Because I was hoping it wasn't getting
It
me.
takes some time before
Oh.
like the delay.